Hello and welcome to Policy Watch, your packed snapshot of the week's biggest business stories, their context, relevance and policy impact. I'm Mishra Russell. Now this week, the Reserve Bank of India opted to keep interest rates intact in the second bi-monthly review of monetary policy on Tuesday. The central bank chose to gauge inflationary pressures and maintained a hawkish position. However, the central bank also affirmed its commitment to maintain an accommodative stance. To discuss this, we are joined by Dr. Praveen Jha, professor at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at JNU, and Ethiraj, policy commentator. Dr. Jha, I'll start with you. As far as policy reviews are concerned, in terms of expectations from stock markets, from ordinary people also, it's kind of become a big media story, but in terms of actual implications in the economy and the fact that there's always such pressure on the RBI governor to reduce rates, but explain the correlation, because I think it's becoming more of a media story than anything else.
You see, it is indeed to a very large extent one of the media hypes. I'm not saying you are part of that, but in general, if you look at the expectation and all the brouhaha and hullabaloo about what will the RBI governor do in terms of rate cut or changing the rate and so on, there is always a lot of expectation and so on. As it happens, in any case, it is a very crude economic theory in terms of what is supposed to be the implications of changes in the rates.
Right.
Essentially, if you're talking about two things, either growth or inflation. Now, both of these depend on a number of things. You can easily have a situation where you might expect that on the face of it, the rate cut, let's say, the growth might pick up because of greater infusion of resources in the economy and so on, but you might not see any such thing.
Right.
And you can take illustrations from countries across the world, right? So, if you want, I can give you several examples, but the simple point is that this correlation itself is highly exaggerated.
Okay.
So, that's one. Also, inflation. You might think that if you do not cut the rate, then it's quite possible that inflation will be controlled and so on. Now, in a country like India, for instance, we know that close to 70% of our inflation has a lot to do with factors like food prices, fuel and so on and so forth, a number of structural factors, supply side bottlenecks and so on. And such a context, in fact, the idea of inflation targeting, to my mind, is one of the most bizarre things.
Okay.
Right? So, various committees which have gone into it, and elementary economics, if you understand your macroeconomics in terms of its basics, my sense is, again, teaches us very well that, look, it is again one of those things which is overstated, hyperbolic kind of thing, that inflation depends so much on what happens to the interest rate and so on and so forth.
All right, but the question then would be, there is a need in the economy to boost consumption. So for that, a rate cut often has been necessitated.
Sure.
And but for example, the last rate cut that happened, I'll get Yatish in on that. The banks have not really passed that on to the customer. I mean, if you're just talking from a customer's point of view. So is it should the RBI be thinking in terms of boosting consumption through rate cuts, or what is the RBI thinking?
So I think, the RBI, I think, is thinking more than just rate cuts. We tend to over-focus on the rate cuts aspect of it. You see, the banking structure at this current point in time is overburdened with NPS. Corporate lending has gone down. If you see in the last 4 months or so, they've actually started increasing retail lending, because suddenly there was this drop in lending per se for every bank, including public sector banks. So you will see that suddenly you will get a lot of emails, phone calls about personal loans. So why is that happening? Because they're trying to find some avenue to lend. Coming to your question that they've not been able to pass it through, who do they pass it through? Corporate sector? Is the corporate sector borrowing? The top 20 corporates which used to borrow heavily, half of them are NPS. The other half of them have overcapacity. They are not investing anymore. So what would they borrow for? They will borrow either for working capital or for carrying on business as usual. There is no large term borrowing in terms of, say, setting up a new plant. setting. That's not happening at the moment in this economy. Will this rate cut get passed on in this structure where you have an NPA, lending is low, borrowers are not willing to borrow? Where would this rate cut get passed on?
Right.
It gets absorbed in the system itself because the system currently has inefficiencies, which is reflected in the NPS.
All right. So then, then it's prudent for the RBI governor to keep the rates where they are.
You know, Ishan, I think as regards the borrowers, we have to take into account the picture which is highly differentiated. So you have the big players who in any case account for overwhelming amount of the NPAs, as you know, who are very fidgety, and banks are also very fidgety in terms of lending to them now,
right,
precisely because of the problem which has arisen of NPAs. But if you look at micro, small, medium entrepreneurs, they have been looking for money everywhere and they don't get it. So, in a sense, you have a huge pent-up demand. Nobody is catering to them. Banks, when the RBI cuts the rate, the lenders, the lending banks, for instance, they are not going to them at all. Now, I think it would make a hell of a lot of sense that you try and target them, give them credit, right? If you look at, where does, as I mentioned earlier, NPA come from in terms of...
but is the RBI doing enough steps on the NPA front?
No.
They are doing some, but it is not enough.
Okay.
And it is not enough, not just because of the fact that you cannot, RBI cannot wave a magic wand and say that, here the NPAs disappear. It is a systemic issue. Why were they given these loans? Once they were given these loans, was there enough risk weightage done after they were given the loans? When these loans were evergreen continuously over this last 3 years, was there a lack of due diligence in the system? Now, all this is systemic and process issues. Rajan can't solve it, even by...
All right, so but then we can't get away with the thing that it's a systemic issue. I mean, the buck stops somewhere. Dr. Jha also wanted to come in. I'll come back to you.
Let me just, give you one number which will help understand this issue better. If you look at growth of bank credit, nominal terms, 92-2003, it was 16.88. Then 2003 to 11, 23.69. Right? These are growth rates. And then you have 11 to 15, it is roughly half of that at 13.58.
Okay.
Right? So, obviously, it has a lot to do with the larger context of the global economy being in a recession, that the credit of take has been roughly half of what it was between 2003 and 11. Now, that is when, it seemed as if there is no end to happy prospects and so on. And now, in a sense, it was that what economists call the animal spirit of the entrepreneurs.
Okay.
Which basically drove them that since these are good times, let's kind of get into whatever we can get into. And crony capitalism also made an overkill. Even responsible
you look at
for instance,
the people holding the NPAs,
exactly.
And then you realize
then there was excessive leveraging, in that, in a sense, good, presumed good kind of larger context and so on. So once these things start abating, then of course you realize that here's a problem at hand, right? I mean, I said that RBI hasn't done very much, but of course, this whole process of restructuring of NPAs, etc., which started from April 14, that is a significant step.
Okay.
But on the whole, is it doing enough? Even if you look at the statements yesterday, today, and so on and so forth, it gives you very mixed signals that maybe we should not get after the banks for some of the faults which happened then, some of the bad judgments, some of the mistakes which were made then, etc. We have to keep in mind that banks also have to take the risks. And these are very fuzzy statements.
Actually, yeah. I mean, that shows a lack of accountability being pinned on people for, and it's a huge problem. It's an elephant in the room that the economy could really make it a tipping point in terms of going down.
So Rajan wrote in his book, he says that banks are a very interesting animal. they are the most risk-averse animal. And the reason they don't take risk is increases with the size of the bank. So it's like a strange world. So he knows the fact that, you know what Dr. Jha was pointing out, that 70% of the lending has gone to large corporate houses. Who start for lending at this particular point in time? The MSME, the medium small manufacturers. The banks still don't have a system to lend into them. They start for lending. They are the ones. MSME creates the largest number of jobs because of the fact that they make small investment, they do less automation and everything else, but they're not getting credit. Credit growth has slowed down, and I pointed out earlier the reason for it. So I think we're not tipping over anywhere. I think we are changing for the better.
Okay.
Because for the first time in our history, you have a RBI governor who created a committee at his level, which is not staffed by politicians or politicians' hangers-on, which has bankers, ex-bankers, and consultants who are supposed to overhaul this NPA machinery.
Okay.
For the first time, big corporate houses, promoters are getting called that if you're not going to pay up, you will need to sell off this asset.
Right.
We've never had it in the past. You see, this is not the first time we faced NPAs. If you go back 10 years in the banking history, you will find that there was another huge amount of NPAs which was created at that point. But they were all waived off.
Okay.
This time that is not happening.
Okay, so accountability is being fixed. It's a process.
It's a process.
Okay.
It takes time.
Very quickly, because we've run out of time in the segment and we want to discuss
now, on
the
that, I
monsoon.
just want to say one thing. Fundamentally, the idea of bank, the old-fashioned idea of bank, that banks are basically institutions which take deposits and lend. Now, once that goes for a toss, which is what has happened in this whole framework of neoliberal economic framework.
Okay.
That is at the root
I
of
think
the
that
problem.
economic framework, we'll have to dedicate a whole half an hour to discuss that and its impact. But on that note, we'll take a very quick break. We'll be right back, because on the other side, we'll be talking about the monsoon. Yes, it's arrived, its impact on the economy and the drought situation. We'll be talking about all that and more on the other side. Welcome back. You're watching Policy Watch. Now, we're discussing the monsoon and its impact on the economy in this segment. And India, of course, is predominantly an agriculture-based economy and therefore is vitally linked to the monsoon rains because of the water resources. A large part of the country gets more than 80% of the annual rainfall during the 4 months between June and September. Now, the Met Department predicted above average rainfall this season after 2 consecutive years of deficient monsoon. Even an average season is enough to boost investor confidence. The monsoon has hit the Malabar coast, and even the slight delay in its arrival is unlikely to have any significant impact on the economy. But what impact will it have, and would it help us achieve this growth rate that we've been talking about, a 7.9% and more? We have with us Dr. Praveen Jha, Professor at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at JNU, and Yatish Rajawat, policy commentator. Yatish, I'll start with you. The monsoons are here, and given the fact that the drought situation that was, was quite alarming, do you think that finally the monsoon is here, but that situation in terms of the structural problems that it highlighted, will those be addressed as well?
So, the structural problem that happened in the last 3 years or so, our reservoirs, which used to be the traditional sources for rainfall, and are down 17% to their capacity, from 40% to their capacity last year. This is a dramatic fall. Punjab, Haryana, large part of Western UP, you have become dark zones. That means the groundwater there has gone below a level that it cannot be taken out for agriculture. This is because of the rampant use of water pumps over the last 15 years, 20 years in cultivating crops like rice, which are not meant for these areas. That's a structural difference which has happened because of this less rainfall over the last 3 years. The third is that our crop acreage has changed dramatically. Again, we've gone, because of certain government policy, we've gone heavy on certain food grains, we've left out oil seeds and lentils and greens and even vegetables to a certain extent. And that also has an impact on water tables, water resources, etc. Now, how does this particular monsoon affect this structure? If the monsoon are normal as has been predicted and the early signs show that they are going to be normal, we're not going to get the reservoirs back to 50% or 40%, maybe 40% capacity if we really have good rainfalls. And the statement does not mean that the reservoirs across the country would have will reach this capacity. Right. But when we say normal rainfall, we mean that X percentage of the area would get proper rainfall, 100%, 110% or so. The second part, which is groundwater, which is a bigger problem. Now, groundwater, as you understand, is aquifers, which have been created over millions of years. So this rainfall is not going to change our groundwater situations for our foreseeable lifetimes.
Right.
Whether we have it this common rainfall for our foreseeable lifetime every year onward. What it will do in terms of the economy is two things. One, it might bring in a little bit more of consumption into the economy because rural wages, incomes will improve. They will again go back into buying and consumption of consumer durables, right, consumer electronics, motorcycles and stuff like that, which has a celebrous effect on the economy per se. So that's the consumption part. The other part is that because of a normal monsoon, we might have some impact on inflation. Now, it will be limited unless until the crop patterns change, because as you know, our inflation was not driven by rise in food grain prices, which is larger north area, but oilseed, which is central India and western India, if that gets proper rainfall this year, we might see an abatement of prices of oilseeds.
Okay, so that could impact inflation.
That's the other side of the equation.
So two major points you've highlighted as far as monsoon are concerned, and the sentiment around the monsoon that was built, that finally we're going to have a great monsoon and our growth rate is going to spike. Dr. Jha, is that argument that is fallacious or true?
You see, in general, it is a valid argument that if, in Indian agriculture continues to be, even after close to 70 years since independence, a gamble of monsoons. This phrase was used by Pandit Nehru. Indian agriculture is a gamble of monsoons, right? So in a sense, it is still true. And to that extent, if the gamble is paying, of course, it helps. So there is a simple, connection between agriculture doing well and agriculture, even though in terms of GDP is just about 14 to 17%, depending on which methodology you adopt, right, of our GDP. Nonetheless, given the
dependence of the people.
Yeah, dependence of people and its various kinds of impact. For instance, if you go to a small town, ask a doctor, what does your income depend on? He says whether it's good agriculture or not, because that's how I get my patients, right, or I don't get them. And likewise, small scale industries and so on and so forth. So clearly the linkage effects are very significant, even though in terms of, if you look at the connection between agriculture and what is known as elasticity of growth in terms of sectors, the importance of agriculture has of course come down very significantly over the years. Nonetheless, if you're looking at a growth rate, let's say from 7% to 8% or 7.6% or whatever, clearly that plays a significant role. However, what is very important to note is it's not the aggregate precipitation, but its distribution, which Yatish partly touched on, distribution in terms of different areas, different regions and so on and so forth. And even within a region, its periodicity and the sort of quantum of rain in every particular precipitation.
Right.
Because it may well be the case that at one go, you have as much as you might have expected for the entire season, and then you're gone, you're finished. Now, this happened, during the last couple of years, and all this has a lot to do with, this, climate change and all kinds of arguments which are there. But it's extremely important to keep in mind that it's not the aggregate precipitation, but it's distribution, both regionally and over the season.
All right. Another point that Yatish also mentioned earlier was about the structural problems that the drought situation of the past 2 years highlighted. Now, we're saying that hopefully a good monsoon will alleviate some of the stress that the farmers and others are facing. But the problems still remain, don't they?
No, Isan, let me tell you one thing. In India, the structural issues are extremely important and are not taken seriously even today, right? Sometimes you will find that, for instance, the fall in output is, let's say, only 10%, but prices have galloped by something like 50%, no, 100%, right? Now, this is where structural issues, right, and there are lots of issues there. Some issues were touched upon by Yatish, for instance, status of aquifers and so on and so forth. But let's say this whole storage issue, the whole system of, how do you manage the supply side constraints, issues of infrastructure, etc. So lots of issues there. And every once in a while, we do hear quite a lot about these things. But unfortunately, in the last 25 years, I would say, if anything, on balance, things have become worse compared to, let's say, the preceding 15 years, before those 25 years. Right? In that sense, for instance, 1980s possibly was a relatively better decade in terms of addressing some of these structural issues, although I would say that we didn't go far enough. But subsequently, and particularly the next 15 years, starting 1991 to, let's say, up to 2004-05 and so on, things were very messy. Right? Then there was some improvement, right, in terms of addressing some of those structural issues. But again, on balance, I would, hold the view that we pay a lot of lip service to it, but we don't really do very much.
All right, interesting point. I'll take that as a final comment because I'll give that to Yatish as well. Final comments, I just have about 2 minutes, but in terms of the overall discussion that we've had today and the fact that the monsoon and the growth rates sort of are interlinked. I mean, I've heard the finance minister himself mention that this year we'll have a good monsoon and therefore the growth rate would increase, but we're already at 7.9%, though some may doubt that figure. But moving from here, do you think that a positive monsoon could really prove to be a big buoyant force for the economy?
Yeah, it does. I mean, Dr. Jha pointed it out. I told you that there are two driving forces for it. One is the consumption part, which is you have 50-60% of your population, which will see a rise in their income. They will become consumers, better consumers. And then there is a Sabnavis effect of that in terms of the fact that if there's a good monsoon, then our diesel consumption goes down. Because as you know that if there is poor monsoon, farmers become completely dependent on water pumps, which is run by diesel, which is the largest import that we have as a fuel in our economy. So that also has maybe a minor impact, but it has an impact on fiscal deficit and government spending. The third component of it is that the amount of fertilizers and everything that is bought in a good monsoon, that actually goes down because you have a better yield of crop happening because of the fact that your fields are now irrigated. And we should not forget that it's not this 4-month period. You see, if these monsoons are good, it also has an impact on the winter crop because the reservoirs are now full. So there are chances that the winter crop will also be better than it was in the last year or a year before that when we faced a bad monsoon. So the whole year you will see a upsurge in the rural economy, so to say.
All right. So the Indian economy then would I safe to say, it could be on an upswing right now if everything goes well, if all goes according to...
Probably Isan may be sort of expecting too much, but certainly,
it's moving forward. It's moving forward, and I think that's a positive note on which we can end the show. Yatish Rajawat and Dr. Jha, thank you very much for coming.
But growth rates very.
That we'll do another show to discuss 7.9 or not. But thank you very much for coming in and helping us understand these issues better. Well, that's it in this edition of Policy Watch. Thanks so much for watching.